So one of the things I like to point out, I find this to be really just not only interesting information, but also very very helpful information. And what's interesting is that what's kind of funny about it is that it doesn't really tell you anything that you didn't already know. It just kind of puts it into a new context. So what this is saying here is that fiber in your diet is good for you, and that's again nothing new. If you know anything at all about nutrition, you know that fiber is good for you. So just to clarify, we're talking about fiber that comes from plants. We're talking about fiber that comes from whole grains. We're talking about things that kind of help keep you full. And so we've known that. Scientists and nutritionists have been saying that for decades, nothing new. But one of the reasons why they're looking at it, or one of the reasons why they're indicating that it might be good for you, is that it actually acts as a food source for quote unquote beneficial bacteria. Now we're talking again very in general terms here, but there are certain groups of microbes that scientists have identified as being good, and other groups that are being identified as being bad. So, without going into too much detail, because you really open up a whole can of worms when you start trying to define what those are. So, we're going to speak in just general terms here. But from a beneficial standpoint, these types of microbes tend to feed off of fiber, and what they are able to break down fiber in the gut and release some of the nutrients from it, and that's something that other microbes can't do. And just to clarify, fiber is kind of something that your body isn't able to digest. Things like starches, or not starches, excuse me, uh, things. Uh, Struggling for an example here. Things like cellulose is an example I was trying to say. Cellulose is a plant nutrient that is generally considered indigestible. And one of the reasons fiber keeps you full, maybe where fiber is a way to keep yourself feeling full and to fill yourself up. One of the reasons why that works is because your body can't really break it down, so it kind of just passes through your body somewhat undigested. Now, the truth is it's undigested by our own cell metabolism, our own body. But what the research is indicating is that these beneficial bacteria actually can digest it for us. So these bacteria in our gut will actually break down the fiber in our body. And when they do that, they don't not only get their own good nutrients from it so that they can themselves grow, but they actually release good nutrients in the process. These are fatty acids and nutrients that are considered very beneficial for our body. So fiber can be thought of as like a food source for good bacteria, and actually something that then releases other good nutrients for you and I at the same time. So eating lots of fiber is a great way to upregulate these beneficial bacteria in the gut. On the flip side of that, sugar, especially simple sugars and high fructose corn syrups and things like that, these tend to be a better food source for the quote unquote bad microbes, or the harmful microbes. It looks like that there's again certain species that are considered harmful, or at least bad. Maybe not always obviously bad, but they don't appear to be very good for it. And these types of microbes tend to thrive on a high sugar diet, whereas they're not capable, or at least not as capable, of digesting the fiber. So when you eat lots of sugar and very little fiber, what appears to be happening is that you're upregulating bad bacteria and downregulating the good bacteria. So a high sugar, low fiber diet is good for the bad bacteria and bad for the good bacteria. Okay, and the opposite is true with fiber. So if you eat lots of fiber and very little sugar, then you tend to get lots of good bacteria and very few bad bacteria. So again, this is nothing that contradicts the traditional view of nutrition. Fiber is good and sugar is bad, but what it's indicating is why that is, and at least partly why that is because of the gut bacteria. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other benefits, but from a microbial standpoint, this appears to be the obvious benefit. Now, as I've said before, each person is different. We all respond differently to different microbes. And so the truth is, these diets will impact us all differently. We all know somebody who can eat whatever they want and not gain weight and appear to be perfectly healthy. And that has to do a lot with genetics. And so these are generalizations that are going to apply differently to every person. But there's a term that I challenge you to look up that kind of contradicts that at the same time. It's called skinny fat, quote unquote, skinny fat. and that's a term that describes someone who appears to be healthy but really isn't. So in other words, just because you're skinny doesn't mean that you're actually healthy. They call that skinny fat. That's kind of a colloquial term. But anyway, that's another can of worms we're not going to open here. Next, I want to talk about an example of a gut bacteria that generally is considered commensal, but under certain circumstances can become a parasite. So kind of like we were talking about from a general standpoint. So this is one that's well known to kind of interact in this way with the human body. It's a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and it's often referred to simply as H. pylori. H. pylori is a bacteria, gram-negative. We'll learn more about what that means later. It's a bacteria found in the intestinal tract of humans, and it's one that's been implicated in stomach ulcers. But what's interesting about it is that studies indicate that up to 50% of the world's population are thought to be infected with H. pylori. It's an estimate. It's not like they've studied everybody, but it's an estimate that indicates as much as half the world may have it. Certainly half the world doesn't have stomach ulcers. So while this bacteria can cause stomach ulcers, it's one, as an example we mentioned earlier, where people are harboring the bacteria without necessarily being affected by it. So what they think is happening here is that some people are harboring the bacteria, and things are changing in the body that cause this bacteria to go from being commensal to parasitic. And while it's not necessarily understood exactly what those changes are, it's generally considered to be things such as stress, poor diet, and even a factor of genetics, which, like most things, genetics have an impact. So the idea is that a lot of people will carry this potentially bad bacteria without any real effect on them, but given a change in lifestyle that could lead to stress, poor diet, and probably a series of genetic factors that are not well understood at this point, the relationship with the bacteria changes, and it's actually able to burrow into the intestinal tract and cause an ulcer, which is really just kind of like a lesion in the lining of the intestines, and that causes some severe pain and discomfort. This is it's interesting for another reason in that it's now recognized that most ulcers, anywhere between 80 and 90%, are actually caused by H. pylori. And this was really only discovered in the 1990s. So prior to that, ulcers were known to exist, but were generally thought to be simply stress-induced. So scientists and doctors generally believe that stress and probably, I think also contributed diet, were the underlying cause. And now they realize that while stress and diet still play a role in that, what the underlying cause actually is a gut bacteria that ultimately causes the ulcer. So it's interesting where, again, the same information kind of still applies. Poor diet, stress is bad for you. But now they're starting to realize exactly why that's bad for you. It's not quite such a general description of being bad. It's bad because that contributes a rise in H. pylori, which leads to an ulcer in the intestinal tract. So that's kind of a well-known example of a microbe that's generally considered to be commensal, carried by a large percentage of the population, that can change and become parasitic under certain conditions. So that's kind of an example of what we mentioned earlier. So on this next part, we want to talk kind of in the same context about other examples in which we have previous diseases that are now being linked to microbes, some of which we have known about but didn't link to these particular diseases. So there's a number of ailments that people can suffer from that can be diagnosed, sometimes even treated, but not necessarily understood in terms of what causes them. So examples would be like schizophrenia, mental disorders, cancers, depression, anxiety, obesity. These things can be often diagnosed, again, treated, and to a certain extent, there's an understanding of what's happening in the body. But the underlying cause has often eluded scientists and doctors alike, and they didn't necessarily know why these things happen. It's not very obvious, for example, why someone develops schizophrenia. However, you can diagnose it and you can treat it without necessarily knowing that. Now, it's not to say that these are being definitively understood, but what they're starting to find is a link here between certain types of microbes that are common amongst individuals with these types of diseases. So the idea is that there's new links in these diseases to microbes that have been previously recognized. So some examples, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. In fact, there's a whole disorder associated with this referred to as PANDAS, which is a very long acronym for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders associated with streptococcal infections. That is a very, very long acronym. In fact, that last I kind of said I misstated that last I isn't part of the acronym. But anyway, the idea is that strep throat infections are thought to potentially affect the psychiatric behavior of individuals and actually cause them to change their brain behavior and their brain chemistry. Now, this is somewhat tenuous. There's anecdotal evidence here. There is some biochemical evidence. I'll have you do some research on this one as well, or have you read an article on this one as well. But the idea is that there's a link between, especially young children around the age of 5 or younger, who are having really problematic psychiatric disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorder, even ADHD, and the anecdotal evidence was suggested to come from a strep throat infection. Doctors were actually, one particular doctor was recognizing that individuals who had these tended to have them in association with a strep throat infection. They were finding that around the time they were getting strep throat infections, their behavior started to change. And that happened enough for them to go and investigate it. And according to the research, they actually found a link between the infection and a change in the brain chemistry that they then assumed to be responsible for this disorder. Now, again, it's not so easy to definitively prove these things. It's a lot easier to bring up some interesting evidence. It's a lot easier to propose this as a potential mechanism. It's much more difficult to go on to definitively prove this beyond all reasonable doubt. So, from my understanding, they have not done that, but they have certainly brought forward some pretty compelling evidence, and I'll have you read about some of that. But the idea is that disorders like OCD can actually be thought, at least in some cases, to be triggered by an infection. Now, to be clear, I don't think anyone's saying that all OCD or all neuropsychiatric disorders have to be related to microbes, but it's to say rather that sometimes they are, and at least that's at least one potential cause for them. Multiple sclerosis is one that's thought to now, in some cases, to be triggered by a soil bacteria. Clostridium perfringens is a very common soil bacteria. This is actually well known to cause certain types of ailments like gangrene and even certain types of stomach and intestinal infections. When you have foodborne illness, this is one bacteria that could play a role. If you eat some bad food, bad food that's set out at room temperature too long, for example, Clostridium perfringens is one that could be making you sick. It's thought now to actually be able to potentially go on to cause MS, multiple sclerosis. Again, not to say that every case of MS is caused by this, but rather that this is a potential potential microbe that could trigger this in some cases. It's actually fairly well known that cancer can be induced by certain types of microbes, even especially certain types of viruses. So this is an example, one that's actually well known now. This one is actually definitively proven. HPV, the human papillomavirus, is one that is now recognized to cause cervical cancer. So this is an example where a microbe actually has been definitively proven to cause cancer. And what this does is it brings up the speculation that perhaps other cancers are caused by other types of microbes. In fact, that's a fairly well accepted hypothesis in today's science that viruses are potent inducers of cancer. The question is, what other examples of cancer are they causing? We know here's one, and the question is how many other are potentially caused by virus. So that's a question I don't have the answer for it, but cancer is something that is now being recognized is caused by microbes, at least in some cases. I do have an interesting article I'll have you read about how meat and gut bacteria can interact to potentially cause intestinal or even prostate cancer. You may have heard, and if you haven't, this is probably something that's good to know. Recent studies are showing that meat, especially processed meats and red meats, have a link to higher rates of intestinal and prostate cancer. Not something that the person who eats lots of hamburgers wants to hear, or someone who likes to eat lots of sausage. But unfortunately, what the research is indicating is that those foods are not only just not good for you because of heart disease and plaque buildup and things like that, but it may also actually induce cancer. And the suggested reason for this is that the food is metabolized by certain bacteria in the gut, and when that happens, those gut bacteria actually release harmful chemicals that are carcinogenic. In other words, they cause cancer. So in fact, in some cases, it may actually be a combination of diet and gut bacteria. And this is why perhaps some people could eat red meat their entire life and not have cancer, whereas someone else could eat the same or even less and then go on to develop cancer because of the way the food interacts with the gut bacteria and then how that affects the body. So you can see how this is really complicated. There's so many variables in these chains of events that it's difficult to definitively nail down each one as a definitive cause of the outcome. But certainly, again, the speculation and the anecdotal evidence certainly tends to follow a certain theme, in that certain people tend to have these disorders when they have a certain bacteria. Obesity is one. I'm going to have you do an article on this one later in the semester. This is actually fairly well understood. In fact, the evidence is really, really compelling and really, really interesting. And what they're basically really have almost shown definitively, not quite definitively, but very, very solid evidence here, that your gut bacteria has a direct impact on how easy it is for you to gain or lose weight. So again, we all know someone who can eat anything they want and never gain weight, and we all have someone, probably this is more common, where for a lot of people it's easier for us to gain weight. I certainly fall in this category where you eat food and it tends to just immediately stick to your body like glue. And what they're finding is that this is attributed to gut bacteria. Gut bacteria help us break down food. That's something that scientists have known for a long time now, that they do play a role in digestion. As it turns out, the degree that they play there is quite variable, not surprising. And in some people, the type of bacteria is more conducive to digestion that leads to less weight gain. And in other people, the gut bacteria is conducive to a digestion that leads to more weight gain. And so genetics is certainly a factor. The types of food that you eat, certainly a factor. Obviously, exercise is a factor. But in addition to all those things that were pretty well established, gut bacteria is now another really big variable. So no one's saying that you're only going to be big or overweight if you have a bad bacteria, but what they are saying is that this is another contributing factor. And apparently it's pretty significant, because what they're finding is that some people really have a hard time losing weight because of their gut bacteria. That type of interaction with the gut microbes simply makes it very difficult for the weight to come off. And for other people, it's the opposite. It makes it very difficult for the weight to be put on. So these are very complicated interactions with the human body, but the studies are pretty clear that certain strains of bacteria are conducive to weight gain and certain strains of bacteria are conducive to weight loss. Now, they haven't yet arrived, at least as far as I know, on any way to swap this around. In other words, I haven't heard of any sort of magic pill that will change your gut bacteria and make you lose weight. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's on the horizon in the next 10 years or so. And finally, this is one that's another somewhat of a speculative link here. I only put this on here recently because of new studies that I find more and more studies coming to this conclusion about autism. Now, autism is very, very, very complicated. It's a spectrum disorder. There are many, many different degrees of autistic behaviors, and autism is not one particular thing. It's a spectrum. But what they have found is that certain children tend to have links to microbes along with autism, and they've even gone on to find that in mice, behavioral disorders with autistic-like symptoms tend to be connected to changes in gut bacteria. So in mice and test animals, they're able to swap gut bacteria and observe behavior. And one of the things that they're finding is that when you swap gut bacteria, the behavior of the mice changes. And this is really fascinating stuff, because while mice don't have the same behavior as you and I, they do have a certain behavior. They do have certain characteristics. Some mice are really active. Some mice are really social. Some mice are really inactive and very unsocial. And it turns out that the gut bacteria can be changed and actually change the behavior in these mice, which is just really incredible when you stop and think about that. So gut bacteria are now being widely recognized to actually influence behavior. Autism is a disorder that influences behavior, and so there's a good reason to believe that there's a link here between bacteria. It doesn't, again, no one's saying that all autism is caused by bacteria, but there's a suggestion being made that perhaps that is one underlying cause. My guess, I'll weigh in my own kind of opinion here. So just clarify, this is just my opinion. I think autism is going to be similar to cancer, is going to be similar to Alzheimer's. They're more of a spectrum disorder. They're not the same thing. It's a very broad term that defines a very broad set of disorders. And I think that in some cases it will turn out that autism can be caused by bacteria. And I think in other cases it will turn out that it has more to do with genetics, or has more to do with the environment, or that it has more to do with conditions in the mother. Other studies have indicated, for example, that the birth weight of the mother has a really big impact, and that fever during childbirth or development can have an impact. So the studies are not consistent. There's not just one set of, it's not like everyone's saying that it's bacteria. There's some people saying it's the mother's body weight, other people saying it's the fever and temperature. Other people have claimed vaccines, which by the way has been completely debunked, and the idea that vaccines cause autism, is a complete myth that has zero substance to it. So that has been more or less taken off the table as an option, although certain people still believe that. The studies that indicated that were completely false and actually fabricated, and the person who was responsible for that lost their scientific credibility and was basically kicked out of the scientific community. So that has been simply removed as a potential, despite what Jim Carrey says, that has been debunked. So autism, very, very complicated disorder, just like cancer, just like Alzheimer's. But anyway, the point is that it's not to say that these are definitively caused by bacteria, but there's a link in which that may be one of the underlying causes. I just want to be clear about that. Okay. So this kind of goes along with what I've been saying, microbes and behavior, but just to kind of put this into its own context, it turns out that microbes can actually generate neurotransmitters in the gut. And for a long time, they've known that gut behavior, or excuse me, gut characteristics, or rather, I should trying to say that brain activity is influenced by activity in the gut. There's been what's referred to as the gut-brain relationship, and they didn't necessarily know why. And what they're finding is that this is very likely in relation to gut bacteria. So it turns out that gut bacteria can actually generate neurotransmitters such as serotonin, and they can actually break down neurotransmitters such as the neurotransmitter GABA, G-A-B-A, which stands for gamma amino, am I saying that wrong? Gamma aminobutyric acid. Let's double check that. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Let's see what that, GABA. Yeah, gamma aminobutyric acid. They've actually shown that some bacteria can actually digest GABA, and some bacteria can actually synthesize serotonin. And these are some of the major neurotransmitters in the brain, and these definitely have an impact on behavior. Serotonin, for example, is kind of a love hormone. Makes you feel really good, makes you feel very connected, very much makes you feel kind of satisfied and satiated. GABA is kind of the same thing, tends to make you very calm and sedentary. And there's indications here that increases or decreases in these types of neurotransmitters can make someone feel anxious or make someone feel depressed. So, for example, depression is generally recognized as a deficiency of serotonin. That's why many of the antidepressants, the treatments for antidepressants are SSR, serotonin, or SSRR, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are antidepressants that basically help you reabsorb serotonin or reuse serotonin so that you get more of it for when you have a lack of it. In other words, it helps you reuse what little serotonin you have. And things like GABA deficiencies are recognized as a potential cause for anxiety or other types of social disorders. So the idea is that they've already attributed certain behavior to a deficiency of these neurotransmitters. And now what they're going on to say is that perhaps the deficiency is actually caused by gut bacteria. So it's also just as easily to say that at a normal level, it can be attributed to gut bacteria. So we tend to look at these when there's a problem, but they're finding that, in fact, the normal behavior is also influenced by gut bacteria. Some of the most compelling research from this comes from mice. Again, mice are not people, and mice have different behaviors than people, so the research is somewhat loose, but at the same time, what they're finding is that, again, mice have their own characteristics. Some are anxious, some are calm. And when you switch gut bacteria, you can actually switch the behavior. You can actually take the gut bacteria from a calm mouse you can take the gut bacteria from a anxious mouse, swap them, and actually swap the behavior right along with that. So let me just repeat that because it bears repeating. A calm mouse tends to have a certain type of gut bacteria that is assumed or hypothesized to make it calm. So that was kind of the original hypothesis. They found certain types of gut bacteria in mice that tended to exhibit more of a calm, sedentary type nature. So the hypothesis was this gut bacteria is being attributed to this type of behavior. And then they found a similar pattern in mice that had an anxious type of behavior. And so the hypothesis was that this type of gut bacteria is attributed to this type of anxious behavior. So in the research, what they did was they took the gut bacteria and they swapped them, and they literally were able to swap the behaviors. So the calm mice became anxious, and the anxious mice became calm. So very, very, very interesting. Again, there's a long way to go between this and human behaviors because, as it says down here, and as I've said already, mice are not people and people are not mice. So there's a big jump between animal behavior and human behavior. And, unfortunately, the way it works is that it's just much easier to do the research in animals than it is to do in people. So it's a long way to go to prove any of this in individuals and in individual people. But certainly a very compelling link to suggest that there is actually a link between these types of behavior.